Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Gahun on Mythic in Aldir.
Yes, this encounter requires a massive amount of coordination before the encounter even begins. So much in fact that before we're even going to begin to break down the phases one at a time, it's best for us to explain and go over all of the assignments you need to make before you even look to pull the boss.
To start off on Mythic, you need to run both upper platforms and simultaneously hand in the power matrix on both sides rather than just on one side. If both sides do not hand in their matrix within 3 seconds of each other, the drive will not gain energy and you'll have to run the orbs again, at which point you're already too slow and you'll be forced to wipe. It's important that these are done as fast as possible throughout phase 1 and 2, so the last hand in and subsequent explosion can be timed perfectly for exact vital points. Your entire raid, including your tanks, have to participate with the upper platforms. You need to split your raid into 5 groups of 4 players, 2 players per side. Because everyone needs to get involved, your raid composition should reflect this and you should try your best to fill up with classes that are effective at running the upper platforms. To start off, you'll want 2 Warlocks, as having a gateway on either side is invaluable. Whilst it's possible to do the fight with no Warlocks, you'd instead have to stack other classes that can solo the sides, or just simply have a much slower kill, which we have no experience with whatsoever, so we can't really comment on it too much, but we do know it's definitely a much harder way of doing the encounter. Ideally, you'll want to use 4 Warlocks. That way you have 2 gateways on either side, one for the guy that picks up the orb, and one for the guy that delivers it. Next to mention is teleport classes. Instead of running up early and spending excessive time clearing the path for you to run across, it's best to instead teleport up towards the middle of the upper platforms, as you'll already be a significant distance along it. The teleport players can immediately go up, have an orb thrown at them, then take the gateway and hand it all in within the space of about 5 seconds. Monks can Transcendence on the pool and keep replacing it throughout the fight whenever they use it, Warlocks can do the same with their portal, Druids can wild charge to any monk statues, and Rogues can Shadow Step to players that are already up there, such as people that are holding the orbs. All these types of classes you should assign as orb catchers, and it's their responsibility to take the gateway and deliver. Other classes that cannot really perform that job you should assign as the original players to pick up the orb and throw it to the catchers after they've teleported up. Ideally, you'll have 10 of these teleport classes, 2 for each group as the deliverers. If you lack this, the players who are assigned for the deliverers who cannot teleport will need to leave and get up there very early to be in a position to catch the orb when it's thrown to them. Now, if you're only using 2 Warlocks, then you'll want to set up the gateway not far from where you initially pick up the orb. Both the orb catcher and the pickup guy can take this gateway and make their own way down together. Once the pickup guy is halfway down or is eventually routed, the catcher can then make the rest of the way there and deliver, but either clearing the path himself or more favourably using mobility spells. If you're using 4 Warlocks like we did on all of our kills, both players can take a gateway each, which allows you to throw the orb and hand it in without having to clear any of the path or rely on any movement spells whatsoever. We have a cheat sheet for absolutely everything regarding player assignments in this fight and a Google document in the description. We recommend either directly copying it or just adjusting it yourself when it comes down to making your own assignments for your raid team. If you can, while you're making your groups, try and make sure that each running group has either a healer or a hybrid class in it. This simply just helps in situations where runners might have stacks from the waves and you'll need to keep them topped up. One thing you'll also find on the sheet is a link to 2 different Weakauras. These Weakauras are what we rely on to when it comes down to calling who is running and when we're ready to hand in. There is quite a lot of communication needed throughout phase 2, and have people calling over voice comms who is up next or when to hand in can become very noisy. These Weakauras work off whisper macros. You need the 10 orb catchers to make a macro that whispers orb ready to the player who is delivering on the opposite platform, and you're next to the 2 people who are running on your side for the next power matrix. One Weakaura simply gives a notification to the deliverer on the opposite platform letting them know that you're ready to hand in, and the other just gives a notification to the next group of people on your side so they know that they need to get ready to go and run the next orb. The last thing to mention about these platforms is that routes will move around between the growths. If you're caught by one of these, you're routed for what feels like an absolute eternity. If your partner can pick up the orb off you and still deliver it, then it's not a big deal, but for the most part, if you're caught by a route, it's pretty much a wipe, as you're going to be too slow at setting off an explosion. The other change is that when you initially pick up an orb, a slow-moving beam will follow behind you. Even if you're not using teleports or gateways or any mobility spells, this beam should never get close to you. If it does, you've already wiped because you're being too slow.
Next to assign is the interrupts. As you'll have 4 people constantly out of the fight running orbs during phase 1, it's important to have your interrupts organised on every last Terra ad. Their Torment cast on Mythic hurts big time if it casts for too long, and you don't really have the damage to flat out burst them down before they manage to channel for long periods of time. You also need to watch out for the tendrils decaying cast and have it interrupted every single time. 2 14-second interrupts is enough to cover this if you interrupt it right towards the end of the cast. Our spreadsheet shows all of the Phase 1 spawn locations. Make sure you have a couple of interrupts per ad just to cover them all, and make sure players who are assigned to interrupt aren't actually upstairs running the orbs at the same time. But with all the assignment stuff out the way, let's actually have a look at the start of the fight. Before you pull, your warlocks and teleporters should position on their assigned platforms. This is because they can pre-place all of their stuff by resetting the boss. You cannot reset the boss by dragging any of the ads upstairs, instead you need to have a hunter do it. This is done by having a hunter shoot Gahun, and as the projectile is in midair, the hunter needs to feign death. If you feign too late, the boss won't care and it will just start attacking the group regardless. Once the boss is despawned, you've got 25 seconds to place all of your gateways, statues, teleports before you pull the boss. Once you've pulled, you want to start running the orbs immediately. Downstairs, you'll want to tank the Dark Young on as many terrors as possible. You only have a single Dark Young throughout this short phase, so don't kill it. Instead, use the Dark Bargain cast as much as you can to help kill off the terrors. Explosive Corruption during Phase 1 is applied to over half of your raid. For this first set, try and keep all the circles that you spawn near where the first set of ads are, as you won't be returning to this part of the room during Phase 1. When any ad dies in this fight, it will spawn a little Gahuni ad. These guys fixate a random player and chase them down. If they reach the player, they'll jump inside of them and apply a dot. When this dot times out or it is dispelled, you will spawn 2 new Gahunis. Try and keep relatively stacked near new terrors that spawn throughout this phase, and that way the ads can be killed off pretty fast as they'll funnel in towards the group. All forms of CC work on these guys, so feel free to throw down some slows and some stuns just to help keep them under control. If you are ever caught out by a Gahun ad, just move towards a large pack and call out for a dispel. That way, the new ones that you spawn will be kept close to the other ones whilst all of your boomkins and your mages and your hunters are absolutely annihilating all of them. Now the second set of terrors spawn near the upper left platform ramp. Keep using the Dark Bargain to help kill them off. The third set spawn with a tendril, slightly more towards the entrance of the room. Make sure that the tendril is interrupted and kill off the terrors. The explosion will kill off the tendril, so don't worry about damaging it. At this time, you'll also have another set of corruption debuffs. Keep them away from the right side of the room because you're going to be using that in a moment. When the fourth set of ads spawn, you'll transition very shortly afterwards. Now, a very quick thing to explain. The entire time whilst you've been doing Phase 1, Gahun has Phase 2 timers ticking in the background, and these timers do not reset as you transition into Phase 2. This makes transition timing incredibly important, because at what point you transition really changes what overlaps you're going to be seeing in the next phase. Different guilds go for different times, but we found that transitioning at the 1 minute 26 mark was the best for us. But regardless of what time you choose to transition, just keep it consistent, as you will eventually get used to the flow of the fight, and you'll learn to deal with any of the overlaps that you happen to get. Just make sure that your third and last group in that phase that are handling the Matrix are aware of this time and hand in at the correct moment. The moment the explosion starts, the raid should stack on the right side of the room and kill off any Gahunis, as the explosion doesn't affect them. Healers need to keep an eye on the orb runners and just make sure they get back to the raid alive. Just before the next phase begins, the next orb runners should leave early to avoid the first wave the boss sends out.
Now Phase 2 is similar to Heroic, except the boss will not cast Explosive Corruption, but instead has another mechanic. Throughout this phase, 2 bursting boils will spawn in random locations throughout the room on a timer. These boils last 8 seconds and then despawn. When they despawn, they'll debuff the 2 closest players with a 30-second dot. Now the problem is that bursting boils spawn more than every 30 seconds, and if you ever get more than 1 stack of the dot, you are mind controlled and have to be killed off. So you need 2 different people to be closest to each bursting boil every time they spawn. As there are always 4 people running the orbs who cannot soak them, and 4 other people in your raid that will already have a stack of the dot, that leaves 12 people each time to soak the boils, and you only need 4. So who are the best people to soak? Essentially anyone. Having the boil soaked properly is far more important than being picky, and it resulting in someone accidentally becoming mind controlled. Just note that if you do soak one of the bursting boils before you go orb running, you're going to drop kinda low. This is the reason why making most orb running groups have at least one healer or hybrid class is a good idea. If not, just simply avoid soaking the boils before you go up. We assign loose locations to spread throughout this phase just so boils can be soaked no matter where they spawn. One thing to note is that they can sometimes spawn very close to each other. We call for more people to come over and help soak if this ever happens, and make sure that we soak on the outside of them rather than the inside of them. This should prevent you from accidentally double soaking and becoming mind controlled. Now the dot itself doesn't do too much damage, but with a couple of wave stacks and ad casts on top of it, it can get pretty rough. You can find an example when it's best to use healing cooldowns to cover certain points in this encounter in a Google Doc that can be found in the description. As for the rest of the phase, it's all about managing wave stacks. So whilst everyone could clear their stacks on all 4 of the blood feasts that you see throughout the phase every single time, you will struggle on killing the ad that spawns, as it will simply have way too much health. We limit the very first blood feast to orb runner group 1 and 5 only, and the third blood feast to orb runner group 4 only. The ads that you'll spawn from blood feast 1 and 3 need to be swapped to immediately and killed off by your DPS. These 2 ads will spawn 2 minutes apart, so manage your cooldowns accordingly. The mind-numbing chatter cast hurts a shitload on Mythic and ideally should never be cast more than twice. When the ad begins to get low, tanks, you need to make sure that it's moved away from the raid and dies on the side of the room in a low traffic area. This is because ads that don't die to the blast on Mythic will spawn a large patch of shit on the ground that deals ticking damage, and you don't want this in the middle of the room. The ad will respawn out of this patch around 40 seconds later, however a blast explosion will prevent this from happening and force it to despawn for good. When it dies, you'll also have 5 Gahooni spawn from that location. These should be number 1 DPS priority. As for Blood Feast 2 and 4, you should have everyone resetting it if possible, as the ad will be killed by the blast on these ones. The only other way to help manage the wave stacks is by flat out avoiding certain waves when you go up to orb run, by either leaving early or jumping down afterwards late. This is something that you'll need to work out yourself for the most part, because it really does depend on who's been assigned to run which particular orb. But as a general rule, if you can leave early or jump down late without wasting much more than say 5 to 10 seconds of time, it's definitely worth it in the long run. You're going to make the ad smaller and you're going to lower raid damage. The damage requirement on the boss in this phase is so low that for the most part the boss just kills himself with the 2 explosions, so don't feel bad if you have to AFK away from the encounter while avoiding waves for a short period of time. There is a list and notes of when each group should look to avoid waves on the cheat sheet. Check them out for a better idea.
Now, to give you an overall better idea of how the phase plays out, let's go through it straight from the start. One thing to note though is that this isn't going to be 100% precise every single time because of the small fluctuations that you get from transitioning the boss each pull at slightly different times. Now, you'll start off by getting 2 waves followed by a boil. After this, the entire raid that's downstairs should stack up to spawn the blood feast next to the boss. Have orb runner groups 1 and 5 reset here. If you are not running 4 locks, group 5 should not wait to reset, and instead should immediately start running the orb. These groups are the ones that are resetting, as they will be running upstairs for the next part of the phase, and you want to have their incoming damage low. Shortly after this, you'll get the second set of boils spawn, accompanied by a wave. The blood feast ad will be active during this time, just make sure it dies before its third cast. You'll then have another wave and a boil. You'll then want to have everyone stack up and reset in the upcoming blood feast. Boils can occasionally spawn during this feast. This is kind of annoying, but players will just have to give up the blood feast reset and go and soak instead. Now at this point, the third matrix should be deposited and you'll get your first explosion. If you're too late, you'll likely get another wave and maybe an ad cast, which is fine, but it's just not ideal. The moment the stun hits, stack up next to the boss. The big ad will die during this, so you need to focus down the Gahoonis as soon as possible before they reach the stacked raid group. DPS shouldn't need to slam cooldowns into the boss during these stuns, as your general damage throughout the phase should be good enough to transition him at the right time. At the beginning of the explosion, you need to assign 1 healer for each orb deliverer so they do not die on the way back to the raid. And just before the stun ends, maybe 10 seconds before or so, the next orb group should leave early to avoid the wave. Now when the stun ends, you'll get wave 5, then wave 6, and then boils 5. Or if you were slow on the first explosion, you'll jump straight into wave 6 and boils 5. After wave 6, stack for the next blood feast. Group 4 needs to reset here, as they may not be able to reset their stacks in the last blood feast of the phase, so any stacks they have now, they're going to continue into phase 3, and you want everyone to have as low stacks as possible. Now another set of boils can spawn during this blood feast. Ideally group 4 doesn't want to soak here if they can, as they do want the reset. The ad will then spawn, and whilst up, you'll have wave 7 and boils shortly afterwards. You want to deal with this ad just like the first, by dragging it over to the side before it casts too many times. Do note that the tank will be by themselves during this time if you're using our suggested groups on the cheat sheet, as the other tank is running the orb. This tank will need to use external and personal cooldowns to survive the combined damage of the boss and the ad, and this is pretty much the highest damage point for that player. After the ad is dead, you'll then have wave 8, and you can now stack for the 4th and last blood feast, whilst the final orb running group gets ready to hand in the moment the blood feast appears. It's at this point you'll begin to transition into the last phase, ideally with little to no stacks on the raid, and with the last tick of the explosion taking the boss down to 20% health. Now before the explosion channel finishes, you want everyone to move to one side of the room and wait for the ceiling to collapse. The collapse always spawns on a random player. By having everybody stacked, it's completely predictable and it's typically way easier for healers. For the first and second collapse, we move from one side of the room to the other, using gateways for the people that still can. The third and final collapse always spawns directly in the middle of the room, so we just stay still and huddled in our corner. Now it's not a good idea to use large output cooldowns here as a healer, as they won't be back up for the final phase. Barriers, spirit links and darknesses however are decent here, as you are spread for the entire last phase and won't get much use out of them. Once the boss is active, you want to re-spread out across the room. We split the raid into 5 different teams and assign them to different areas around the boss just to give people as much room as possible. Now this final phase is very similar to Heroic, except the wave stacks will go much higher, and you'll need to soak boils, and the timing of the abilities are a lot more brutal. DPS need to make sure they save all cooldowns going into this phase, as you've got to blow up the boss before your healers can no longer cope. You should expect on a first kill to go up to 8 wave stacks. Any higher than that, then your healers are gods. The only solid advice we can give you in this final phase is just to constantly track timers and try your best to stick into your assigned area of the room. Growths can easily force a large amount of players into a small space, and if a wave is due in at the same time, you can easily wipe. That being said, each growth set always has 3 safe spots, and if you stay roughly in your assigned area, you should never end up in a situation where you are forced to cleave a wave onto each other. Note that growths, waves and boss fears will happen on Boil 5 and 6. This is also where wave stacks are on the high side, and yeah, this is the single-handedly most difficult part of Phase 3. But for the most part, if people just remain calm and deal with the mechanics whilst just being mindful of others, you just got to be kind with your space in this last phase, it's really just a damage check. Healers at the start of the phase should consider damaging the boss until maybe wave 2 or 3 just to help out. Past that point, you kind of just need to assign cooldowns to try and extend the duration of the fight for as long as you possibly can. And honestly, that pretty much wraps up the guide. Just as a conclusion to this guide before we do end it, make sure you use the sheet. The amount of time that you're going to save just by having clear assignments and a full understanding of the fight will just reduce your pull count big time.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you'd like to have a written version of this guide for you to take notes from or simply reference between pulls, then check out our guide over on Wowhead. The link for that can be found in the description. Thank you to all of our patrons and their continued support. We really do appreciate it, and we'll catch you all very soon with PTR previews of the next tier. Take care.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.